This week, we're going to be talking about the path that led our founding fathers to create a policy of religious tolerance. The concept evoked in the Bill of Rights that allows for the freedom of religion did not come easy. As we'll see in this week's readings, many people were concerned with the question of religion. But why is that? So, if we look at this map of 1760, which is just 16 years before our readings take place, we see that religious pluralism permeated the colonies. This did not happen elsewhere. In the 18th century, most nations had a state-sponsored church, which meant that if you were the subject of the king of a particular nation, you followed his religion. And you were a subject of the king if you lived in his territory. So pretty much everyone living in the king's territory followed his religion by law. Now, at this time, those in Great Britain were Anglicans, or members of the Church of England, while French and Spanish colonists adhered to Roman Catholicism. In 1760, 9 of the 13 colonies supported one of two state-sponsored religions. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut were Puritans or Congregationalists. New York, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were Anglicans. And only 4 of the 13 colonies, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, did not have an official religion. Now, this is not to say that other religions were banned from these colonies. Rather, these state-sponsored religions were funded by mandatory state taxes. So you could be an Anglican in Massachusetts, but you were still required to pay taxes supporting the Congregational Church, even if you chose not to be a member. This was the problem the Founding Fathers faced when writing the Constitution. Religious pluralism made it difficult to prioritize one religion over the other. So, while establishing no national religion was an extremely radical phenomenon at the time, the Founding Fathers didn't establish this principle for the sake of radicalism, nor for the sake of freedom per se. Their reasoning for not establishing a national church is simply because they couldn't agree on one. So how did we get to this pluralistic society? To answer this, we need to work backward from 1760. There are 6 main sources we can credit for the radical religious pluralism permeating the 13 colonies in the 18th century. They are salutary neglect, consumerism, immigration, geography, the Enlightenment, and finally, the Great Awakening. So we're going to analyze each of these in order to show their effects on the pluralistic colonial society that was America in the late 18th century. We first heard the term salutary neglect at the beginning of the semester. It refers to the period prior to the 7 Years' War, where Great Britain pretty much left the colonies to govern themselves. We can also apply it to religion in the colonies. The biggest problem hindering the growth of the Church of England in the colonies was the lack of a local bishop, which they did not receive until 1784. Without a bishop, ordinations were impossible. So if you were living in the colony and wanted to be ordained in the Anglican Church, you had to travel to England, then back to the colonies. As we can see in this image, which depicts the New York skyline in 1771, there are 18 separate churches right along the riverfront. While New York's state charter established the Church of England as its official religion, we can clearly see it did not dominate the other religious sects. We've also already studied the role of the colonies as consumers, and we can apply this to religion as well. What it all comes down to is that the colonists loved their goods more than anything. Without England monitoring church attendance, the colonists could revolve their lives around material goods and the best ways to acquire them. So what we see is that religious devotion is not first priority in this environment. It takes a back seat to this consumer culture and its devotion to material goods. Before 1680, 9/10 of white colonial Americans were of English stock. From 1700 to 1760, we see a huge migration of people from all over Europe move into the colonies. In 1700, the total immigrant population of British North America was about 250,000 people. By 1740, the total immigrant population of British North America is about 905,000 people. So in a matter of just 40 years, this number has almost quadrupled. By 1760, it's grown even larger. These migrations brought enslaved Africans, Germans, Swiss, Scotch-Irish, Dutch, French Protestants or Huguenots and their cultures to the New World. Now, religion was a big part of these Old World cultures, so in addition to the Congregationalists and Anglicans, colonial America adds other religious sects to its roster, including West African religious traditions brought by enslaved Africans, Presbyterians, who were Scotch-Irish Reformed Calvinists mainly residing in the backcountry region, Lutherans, or German exiles from the Protestant Reformation, Dutch and German Reformed groups, German and Swiss Anabaptists, which included Moravians, Mennonites, and Dunkards, Quakers, whose namesake came from their emotional services at which they literally trembled with emotion. And there also existed a small amount of Roman Catholics from the French and Spanish colonies of North America, as well as Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. So at this time, there was just this massive mixture of religious culture existing in the 13 colonies, and this did not exist anywhere else in the world. Now, despite these different cultures living in this one concentrated area of the world, we do have some sort of separation between them. This is a map detailing the predominant ethnic groups in the colonies in 1760. We can see the various cultures that would have coexisted in 18th century colonial America. The dispersed region of the colonies enabled dissenters to practice their different religions without aggravating each other too much. So what we see is a literal separation of church and state. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that began in Europe and is usually associated with the 18th century. It promoted reason, knowledge, and scientific ways of thinking. The philosophies of Enlightenment thinker John Locke were the most influential to the Founding Fathers. Locke was an English philosopher who believed all people have natural rights. He was one of the founders of empiricism, a theory that all knowledge originates in sensory experience. His most famous work, published in 1689, is titled Two Treatises of Civil Government. In it, Locke argues that governments exist for the sake of the people, not vice versa, and through the creation of a social contract, the government should protect the people of their natural rights to life, liberty, and property. The First Great Awakening was a series of religious revivals in the colonies in the 1730s and 40s. It was a movement away from the formal religious culture of the past, and it sought to personalize religion through human emotions by centering religion once more on the heart rather than the head, on faith rather than reason, and on grace rather than good works. Like Enlightenment thinking, the Great Awakening moved to make religion cater to the people rather than the other way around. It was a top-down approach, where the channel of authority no longer flowed from God to the rulers to the people, but from God to the people to their elected representatives. George Whitefield is the most important of these Great Awakening elected representatives. As an Anglican priest, Whitefield was thought to be too radical to preach in the church. So he went on a series of tours through the colonies, and his outdoor ceremonies gathered crowds by the thousands. Jonathan Edwards is also an important figure of the Great Awakening. His famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," sought to invoke fear in colonists who chose to ignore religious devotion. Both Whitefield and Edwards caught the attention of the non-church-going crowds, invoking a new sense of religious purpose that had previously been ignored because they had felt excluded. So, in conclusion, by Great Britain's decision to overlook the establishment of the Church of England in the colonies, the Americans were free to govern their religious preferences, including when and where they worshipped, if at all. The influx of various immigrants brought a mixture of religious cultures to the British colonies that existed nowhere else in the world during the 18th century. These various religious sects coexisted rather peacefully through the sparse region of the colonies. The rise of Enlightenment thinking, which favored sensory experience, made way for the religious revivals of the Great Awakening, which brought religion to the forefront of the colonists' minds once again. All this talk of religion then, by the 1770s, had the Founding Fathers at a loss for what to do. Every nation had an official church, so to create a constitution without one would be unusual. But to come to terms on which church the American government should adhere to in a society as pluralistic as the colonies in the 1770s would be impossible.